Guys, this episode ended up getting amazing. Roughly, we'll put the time code, but we got onto an absolutely fascinating topic, and I'll be heartbroken if you don't at least watch that. So this episode was rad. I promise you, you will not regret it. You can go into the beginning where we talk hardcore COVID stuff, or you can skip right to the time code. This is going to be right there. We'll put it, I don't remember where it was, roughly sort of halfway through the episode. We got into end of life and some really, really fascinating stuff. So be sure to check that out. Hey everyone, this episode is brought to you by our sponsor, BetterHelp, an online counseling company with the mission to make professional counseling accessible, affordable, and convenient. I hope you enjoy. Dr. Jennifer Haythe, thank you so much for joining me. Super excited to get this chance to talk to you.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited too.
Awesome. So this is a pretty weird time to be in the medical field. I see your scrubs hanging behind you. Are you more at Columbia University, the school, or are you more at the actual hospital?
Yeah, so we have a medical center that's associated with our university, Columbia University Medical Center. And that's where I had spent most of my COVID days.
And is it still pretty hardcore? Is it pretty hardcore COVID there still?
You know, it's actually calmed down a lot. I would say, it was pretty intense there for a while. I had never seen anything like it. And frankly, I didn't think that any of my mentors and older doctors that I, have worked with for so many years had seen anything like it. It was really, it was pretty overwhelming. The entire hospital became, I would say, probably close to 80% COVID. Lots of floors had to pop up and turn into intensive care units to manage these patients. And one day, I walked around and I suddenly saw that, every ICU bed had 2 patients to a room. Every operating room had 4 patients in a room, all on ventilators. And it just felt like the whole hospital was on a ventilator and everyone had the same exact disease. Everyone had COVID. And it was bizarre. It felt almost like what I would think war would feel like a bit, where you have your teams and you trust your teams and you really depend on them to sort of get you through and support each other. And it was heavy.
Yeah, that is something that everybody seemed to be super focused on in the beginning. I'd think that story would have resonated. It would have been like front page news, somebody telling a story like that. Now I'm beginning to worry that either because of summer, or just like the climate where people have been pent up, bad things are happening to the economy. Obviously, what's gone on with the protesting, that people are so fed up with so many things that now they're acting like the virus will give them a breather. But you're saying that we're not seeing the sort of explosive need of the hospital. What do you think is going on? Is it that it's summer months, it's vitamin D, it's sunlight, it's people being outdoors? Is it that the lockdown was actually effective? Is it that the virus is mutating? Like what do you, if you had to hazard a guess, and I know that right now it would be a guess, but if you had to hazard a guess, like why are times getting better?
I think it's probably a couple of different things. One, I think that there was this latent period where we didn't know the virus was spreading between people and people were getting infected. And since we know that most people that get COVID have pretty mild symptoms and, aren't going to be that, they probably thought they had the flu or a bad cold. And so they were home spreading it. And then we reached this just sort of massive number of people infected. And when you get to that many infected people, you're going to see a lot of people who need hospitalization. And so it reached this sort of climax or pinnacle where suddenly the hospitals just couldn't manage it anymore. But what's not going to happen is it's not going to just disappear and go away. And it's not going away because it's sunny out. And it's still there. The concern, I think, of people like Fauci and other infectious disease doctors is that when we start being indoors more in closed spaces, on the subways, going back to work, reopening, that the spread is going to go up again. Whether we'll ever have that moment we had, at least here in New York City, where it was literally like you had to choose who got a ventilator and who didn't, and thousands of people dying every day. My hope is that doesn't happen again, but that we will have to deal with COVID for the next year, chronically coming into our hospital and trying to minimize spread within the hospital, which I think we're doing a really good job.
And if this becomes something that we see every year, like a flu,
Yeah.
how gnarly is this going to be? Like right now, man, I treat this shit like it is panic central. I don't let people in my house. I am washing or wiping down all my groceries. It is a nightmare. Like, and I know everybody's going through this, but like, what a pain in the ass to one. I don't even want to go to the grocery store, right? So I'm getting everything delivered, which miracle of miracles that we live in a time where that's possible. But I don't even want like to go back to the office, even though like we have a cleaner that could come in and like be wiping all the surfaces and stuff. But it just seems like, man, anything that I can avoid, I want to, which was fine when I thought this was like a month or 2 months. But living with that like elevated level of paranoia, I'm actually not sure humans are capable of that. I think we will end up letting our guard down. I'm already, I can feel myself getting a little bit lax at the edges. So what does this look like if it's really ongoing and it's just here cyclically every year?
Well, I think the hope is that, viruses that spread the best and stay the best are generally not going to be viruses that kill you quickly. Because like Ebola, if you're going to have a 50%, death rate or mortality, the virus won't even be able to get to the next person, to find a new host. So things like influenza, all other coronaviruses, like the common cold, those things are mild. And so you give it to me, I give it to you every time. Nobody cares. And it just kind of spreads around and people get sick and they get better. If this virus wants to stick around, it may mutate into a less virulent form, which is usually what we see over time. The other potential is vaccination. Now, whether vaccination will say you don't get it is unlikely. It's probably going to be more like a flu vaccine scenario where you get something and you get a milder version or you don't get quite as sick. And then that will also allow people to come out and to us to have, some kind of herd immunity to this, which is really the goal. But to achieve herd immunity before that would require millions of people to die. So we're buying our time, letting people get infected. I mean, people are still getting infected. We're still treating them. It's just that at least the hospitals can manage the intake. I want to reassure people in that really the people who die of COVID, for the most part, we've seen are in a much older age bracket or with a lot of other medical conditions. That doesn't mean I haven't seen people in their 30s with nothing wrong with them. So yes, you're right to think, oh my God, what if I get COVID? I'm screwed. I could die. Any of us could die, but you could also get H1N1 flu and die. So there is like this loss of memory that we forget that like you could die of the flu too as a young, healthy person. It does happen. It's not common. I think probably COVID is worse than the regular flu, but it does happen.
I got the flu in January and it was so gnarly that by the end of it, I was like, oh my God, like this really can kill people. I was like, this shit was real. I've never had something linger that long. Like I always think of being sick as a 7-day commitment. And so at day 10 to have still been like, yo, I just cannot get out of bed. This is crazy. And I had been lulled, but the common cold, the sort of average flu had lulled me into the sense of you get sick, you get better. And that it was a foregone conclusion that you get better. And then when it just wasn't going away, and I was coughing so much, I was like, man, I must be doing damage to my lung tissue. Like you can't cough like this and not have some scarring or something. And that actually brings me back to COVID. So one of the things that made me so interested in talking to you, because you're an expert in the heart, is what is happening at the heart level? Like, does the normal flu do damage to the kind of tissues that we're seeing COVID doing, or is this something totally different?
So that's a really good question. So the flu can actually cause a cardiomyopathy, which is an enlarged heart. It can cause a myocarditis. So but rare. These are rare instances, but viruses causing damage to different parts of the body is nothing new. We've seen it. What's really interesting about COVID or coronavirus, SARS-2, seems to have a really interesting effect on the vasculature. So the blood vessels that are sometimes microscopic in size in your lungs, in your brain, in your skin, in your heart, in your kidneys. And that's why we're seeing this multi-organ systemic involvement in people often who get really sick. So we're seeing strokes, heart attack picture, myocarditis, inflammation, arrhythmias, enlarged hearts. We're seeing kidneys that fail and then eventually recover. We're seeing terrible skin rashes. We're seeing a Kawasaki-like syndrome in children, which is a vasculature disorder. So I keep saying to my friends, COVID is sort of like a contagious vasculitis. And a vasculitis is an inflammation of the blood vessels. And usually it's more of an autoimmune process, but there's something about it that feels like a contagious vasculitis. Like you can catch it the way you catch a cold.
Yeah, that makes this a lot scarier to me. If I think about in terms of even people that aren't showing symptoms, and I'd love to know if this is actually true, but I heard that even people that don't show symptoms, if you were to x-ray the lungs or look at the heart, you actually do see tissue damage. And that is where this starts to get really scary, because you want to think, well, I didn't show symptoms. I'm young, I'm strong, whatever. And so I'm fine. But then you actually look at a tissue level. It's like, no, you're not fine. And every insult, and this is where, what a weird balance to have to, it's like we're walking this razor's edge of protecting people from a health perspective, but also not letting the economy just absolutely implode. We've already seen sort of how much of a powder keg that can make things. But it's like if somebody else gets me sick, and even if I don't show symptoms, and in their mind, they're being sort of flippant about it. Well, I'm not around anybody who's old or whatever, with underlying conditions.
I'm young, I'll be fine.
Right. But that they're sort of edging me closer to the grave, because even if I was able to overcome it now, but it just chipped away at something. You know what I mean? That's where, I get super nervous. I'd love to know, like, how profoundly are we talking? The average person, I get it. There's people that sort of at the high end is devastating. They obviously die, need a heart transplant, whatever. And then there's people who it's super, super minor. But like, if you had to sort of pick a median, 50% fall below, 50% fall above, roughly where are we at?
I think that, I'm seeing the worst of the worst. And I'm also seeing in my ICU, the people who make it to the ICU and who we're going to try to really save, as opposed to a 90-year-old who says, I don't want a breathing tube, right? So I'm self-selected to see a very specific group in the intensive care unit. So which are sort of younger and possibly, the ability to make it through. While I realize that there may be long-term abnormalities that we're seeing in the tissue of people with more mild or moderate disease, I feel hopeful, because it seems like the majority of people who recover are okay. And that there is a fraction, I would say, maybe it's 10%, 15%, 20%, who have some kind of ongoing issue, whether it's, they have a little, like you said, if you get a CAT scan, their lungs might have scarring. That doesn't necessarily mean that they are not okay. They may have scarring. I mean, we have people who have lung scarring who can go run a marathon. That's not the end of your life. I mean, even the people who had fulminant heart failure, I've seen recover. So it's still a work in progress to understand. I think that people who've had it and recovered and feel okay shouldn't be worried, but we don't have any long-term data. We don't know for sure what happens to people 2 years after COVID. And that's the scary part. And I think
do you have a hypothesis? Like, so if you were going to, this is what I always tell people to do in business, right? So you have information. So you're obviously very informed about the heart. So whatever hypothesis you're going to form is what I call an informed hypothesis. Then you've also been dealing with COVID, so more information there. So obviously, all of it is incomplete, but you've got enough information, I'd say you'd be able to build an informed hypothesis. And so what do you think is happening biologically? Why is this virus weakening the vasculature, for instance? And then coming out of it, what can people do to improve themselves?
Right. Well, first of all, the best thing you can do for yourself is to be as healthy as possible going into any of these things. So we know for a fact, based on data, that people with obesity, diabetes, hypertension, underlying heart problems, they're at higher risk. So we already know off the bat there. So if you've been in quarantine for 3 months and you're going to be home, this is the time to eat healthy, get in shape, get your risk factors under control. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You want to be a healthy person. You can't control your age. Your age is what your age is. But I try to reassure people that are younger that it's, you're probably going to be fine. It's okay. But if you get it, you have to take it seriously. Another issue is I think that in many instances, there were so many people that got sick at once and their access to care was delayed. And if you are not feeling well, instead of having that mentality, like, I don't want to go to the hospital, everyone there has COVID, go to the hospital and get treatment. And I think that that's going to really help a lot of recovery is earlier access to treatment instead of delayed and waiting. And also people didn't know, right? They didn't really know they had COVID. So
What
they
is the
just thought they
treatment
had
now?
the flu.
If I were to come in and say, man, I really think that this could be COVID, you test me, it is.
Right.
What's the protocol? I don't need a ventilator, let's say. So we're
Let's say,
before
okay,
that.
so let's say your oxygen's a little low and you're coughing a lot. So we would give you oxygen. Now there's a lot of data on steroids. There was a big study that came out about dexamethasone. I mean, steroids have been around forever, and they basically prevent an overwhelming immune response, right?
So
So
is this
they're
the
going
cytokine storm? Is that what you're
right. So the
using?
hope is that we'll decrease inflammation, decrease the cytokine storm. For whatever reason, coronavirus affects the blood vessels walls and the cells and kind of causes them to pull apart and then leak. And when they leak like that, we call it, capillary leak. The fluid extravasates into the space around. So you get fluid in your lungs, you get compromised tissue in the heart, in the kidney. And so steroids in some manner may or may not prevent that. We use steroids to fight normal vasculitis or inflammatory disorders, autoimmune diseases, to suppress your own natural immune system and immune response. So that's, the theory behind that. It's going to be supportive care, but I think the important thing about supportive care, like giving you some steroids possibly, or giving you remdesivir, which is an antiviral, or giving you oxygen, those are supportive treatments, right? None of those things are curing you from coronavirus. So we want to support you as much as we can. And the issue is we don't want to let you languish and let your oxygenation get worse and you spiral into this worsening respiratory status. And that can happen if you're just sitting at home. I mean, my parents asked me, like, what should we buy? And I said, the best thing I think you should buy is like a pulse oximeter, which are those little things you stick on your finger and they tell you what your oxygen is. Because you might have an oxygen of saturation of 90% and not even know it. You might not even feel that short of breath. And then by the time you get to the hospital, you're at 70% and they're putting you on a breathing tube. So early intervention is better.
So going back to getting your underlying health conditions in order, what can people do to improve themselves?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if you start to look at who's at risk and you look at something like high blood pressure, like high blood pressure is a vascular disorder. It is a disorder of the blood vessels and the arterioles throughout your body. And what is it about that abnormality that predisposes you to increased severity or increased risk of getting this virus? Is it that your risk of getting the virus is the same as everybody else's, but that the effect on your blood vessels will be different? Probably. Is it that, the medications you're taking for your high blood pressure have some interaction? We don't know. And what about obesity? Also a disorder where your vasculature may be compromised because, you have low exercise, you don't work out, your heart is not, in great shape. I mean, there's a million interplays, and I don't think it's going to be one simple path. I don't think it's going to be this causes this causes this. I think, we see that some people get this overwhelming cytokine response and their lungs are completely filled with fluid. I mean, white out on the CAT scan with COVID. And I've seen an 80-year-old lady come in and barely be sick and go home. It's like, why? That's the $1 million question, is why in one is it so different from another? And like all viruses, though, I will say, there is a tolerance, right? The reason why the Spanish flu was so bad was that it was a variant we hadn't seen and nobody had any immunity. Like once we build up our own immune system's ability to fight this, we'll be better off. The question is, how do you do that in advance as sort of preventative? And like I said, the best we can offer is, vitamin D, maybe take some zinc, although we don't know if that's for sure, exercise, run, take good care of yourself, eat healthy foods. But those are all recommendations we give for people's heart anyway.
Yeah, I was going to say, and that's, I think, part of what I am really excited to see people actually get the information around, because what I hear in terms of what people should do for COVID is just what you should do, period. Like if the overlap between do this for longevity and do this for COVID border on 100%.
Totally.
And so that's why I'm trying to, like, even when you look at obesity, diabetes, heart disease, stroke, Alzheimer's, they all start swirling around diet, quite frankly. Diet, exercise, certainly to an extent. But if you were to press me to say, okay, you can only influence one diet or exercise, I wouldn't go to diet faster. I would go to diet like 1,000-fold over
Hmm.
exercise. Exercise is rad, but at least in bodybuilding, they always used to say you can't outrun a bad diet. So no matter how much cardio you're doing, at the end of the day, you're still doing some level of damage from what you're eating.
Hmm.
So that's why, like, just trying to understand, like, at a cellular level, where the breakdown is, what's going on. Like, I'm intrigued by vitamin D. That's been the thing through this that I've been obsessive about. So I'm very grateful that I live in Los Angeles right about now. But I'm curious, like, as you look at the research that's coming out, are people beginning to understand what's happening at a cellular level, or are we still just flying blind?
I mean, I think there is research coming out where they're trying to understand, what kind of antibodies are made against COVID, what
What
we're
would that
finding.
tell us? I actually know
Well,
nothing about
if we
antibodies.
look, right. So if you look at the plasma of people who have had coronavirus and you look at the kinds of antibodies they have, and then you test those antibodies against receptors that we know exist on the COVID virus, they're finding that there are certain antibodies that completely eliminate the ability of COVID to, enter other cells. So, you think about a virus comes in, it takes over your cell, it becomes like a hijacker, and it makes that cell produce all this virus particle. And then it spews it all out, and then more viruses cruise around and invade another cell and take over that cell and produce tons of virus particles. And then the circulating virus itself then causes damage to all your body parts. So if you get a vaccine or that has an antibody or antibody therapy for COVID, you're going to want to give someone antibodies that literally block the receptor. The cell expresses it, sits out on the front of the cell. The coronavirus comes along with its receptor and it's blocked, can't get in because this antibody won't let it get in. So, this is the kind of things that we are looking at when we try to understand how to stop it.
I wanted to go back to something you said earlier. You talked about the 90-year-old patient that shows up and has a do not resuscitate. Being a physician at your level and your expertise, I'm sure puts you in touch with death a lot. Super curious to know how you think about end of life. I feel like I may have some not widely held beliefs about end of life. I think that, God, this is going to sound weird. I think that people may cling to being alive to a point that doesn't make sense. And from the outside, when you're watching it at the end and there's no joy to be had, someone that I cared about, I watched them die. It was so gnarly, and they were sort of in and out of consciousness. And they, at the very end, I couldn't understand what they were fighting for. And it was because it was a one-way street. It was cancer. Like, there was just nothing left to be done.
Right. It was the end.
It was the end. And I so respected his mentality. Like, he had this shirt that he wore all the time that said, "Can't stop, won't stop." And I was like, fuck yeah, man, I respect that. Like, that's rad. That is a great way to live. But if I'm honest and I were in his situation, there is a point at which you go, this is a fight I can't win. It's not like I can get to the other side of this and there's quality of life. So now it's like existing just for the sake of existing. Whereas I personally would rather tap out a little earlier in a way that's a lot more peaceful. And I'm curious, like, how you see different people dealing with that. Do we deal with it the same here that people deal with it elsewhere? What are your thoughts on that?
Oh man, death is such an interesting topic. I mean, I think the way you perceive death changes as you age, right? And as you grow older and as you experience death in your own life. I think that our culture has a very strange relationship to death in the United States compared to some other cultures, and how
in what way?
There is this, like you just pointed out, this sort of relentless, like, I want everything done. I want everything done. I can't tell you how many people where I'm like, what are you doing? Like, this is actually like almost torture, like where we've had to call ethics consults because the doctors feel uncomfortable prolonging life that the family wants prolonged. And yeah, do we have machines that can do these things and your loved one is alive, but they're not alive. They're on 10 different machines. And as soon as you turn one of them off, they're dead, So, I mean, a lot of places, especially, countries that have socialized medicine, they don't spend money like that at the end of life. They will, or they won't offer things. Like, we don't have the resources to offer dialysis here. This is a futile treatment to offer dialysis. And so I think it's in part the healthcare like industry's fault, and because we're like, we can offer this and we can try this and let's try that. And then part of it is the mentality, like, I have the right to choose all these things for my loved one. And I tell my patients sometimes when I'm doing end of life, I say, you know, you're not deciding whether your loved one lives or dies. Your loved one is going to die regardless of what you decide here. We're all going to die, and they're going to die sooner. The question is, how do you want that death to be? Do you want it to be calm and peaceful, or do you want to continue? And sometimes it's a process. It takes people a few days or weeks to kind of come around to understand it. But, there are countries where, people take their loved ones home and die in the home, and it's not scary and it's not, horrible. And they can even keep the body there and have like a night or two with the body. I mean, people do things totally differently in other cultures. And one of my mentors was always like, not everyone has to die in the intensive care unit. And it's so true. Like, there's a time when it's enough. But I mean, to your point, like the mentality of fighting, I think it's so hard. When I was younger and I was in training and I would see people die, I think I would have this very unemotional reaction as a resident, because you would like run to these codes and people would live or die, or, see so many people die. And it felt very like robotic, like, oh, someone's died. Now, as I got older, and I'm like, hopefully not going to die soon, but like you start to think about it more. And when I feel like now when I see death more in the hospital, especially with COVID, I think like, wow, like that's it. Like that person is done. And like, it feels different to me now. Like it feels more profound, but also like we don't always have to do everything. Like I feel very much about, helping families try to get through the dying process in a way that's more manageable. And I think it's starting to change. Like there's a whole new workforce of palliative care doctors and hospice trying to make death better. But I get, death's scary because we don't know what happens. We don't know if that's it.
Interesting.
You're dead.
I am not tripped out at all by no. I'm tripped out by death to the point where I want to live forever. And I mean that quite literally. Even though I think there are huge issues if people were to live forever, I think that might actually be wildly problematic. But nonetheless, selfishly, I'm an asshole. I want it for myself. And
you wouldn't get bored? You wouldn't feel like...
No. There's a book you must read. It's called Einstein's Dreams. And it's this whole like short stories around time. And one of them is, what if everybody lived forever? And the hypothesis of that story, which resonated with me so much, I think about it all the time, is the world would bifurcate into two types of people. People that did nothing because there's always time to do it tomorrow. And then people who did everything because they could actually get good at everything they ever wanted to get good at. And I thought, oh my God, I fall into that camp. I'm so aggressive. And this is why death freaks me out. It's like, I am constantly running this thought experiment of like, yo, my time is finite. I can only spend it in so many different ways. And that bothers me to a level I don't know how to articulate. The mere fact that the things that I find interesting and fascinating that juice me up, I can't do them all. And that causes like this deep sense of unease. I can't even let myself think about it. So I always tell people, if you want to be successful in life, you have to think about this.
You won't have time. Like you won't have time to learn Spanish. Like you won't have time to, like that kind of stuff.
100%. Yeah. So while I have built my life and my psychology around learning, and that's it, not knowing, not being, I get rewarded all the time for being something. And I try like not to think about it, but I know that like I have to work so hard to want to reinvent myself, to want to learn where I'm wrong. It's very, very hard. And so even I worry because I can feel as I get older, something is changing. I won't say whether it's better or worse. I can just feel that I am changing. And so
as you age,
as I age, 100%. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason I think people are obsessed with kids is they're just so doe-eyed. Like they're optimistic about everything. And then over time, you get all these weird things that reside on a layer of your subconscious that is hard to access. And my wife has put it perfectly. And she has really encouraged me to focus on this because she says you've hardened over time. And I used to be very playful. And so now I try to like bring that back. I try to embody that playfulness. I try to really take time to be playful. But when I think about that, without conscious thought, it happened. It goes back to what we were saying about the virus. It's like the virus just, the one time you got sick, no big deal, you got better. But it did sort of take some number of days off your life. And you just, enough of those. And it's all sort of accumulating in your subconscious. And so you have to fight against that. So anyway, back to death and end of life, which I am beyond obsessed with this whole idea, this whole notion. So palliative care and where that's going, I am really intrigued. I would love to know, the people that you're seeing work in this space, how do we make death better? What does that mean?
So what I've learned from them, because they're really the experts, is when we go to talk to people, they ask them questions, like, assuming that the person can still communicate, but they ask questions like, what brings meaning to your life right now? What do you enjoy? How would you want to die? How would you want your family to be around you when you die? Is there anything that's bringing you meaning to your life now while you're in the hospital that makes you want to be alive? Like really trying to understand the patient, because I think we project so much of our feelings about death onto the person, and we don't allow them to express themselves because like they're the ones
That's
dying.
Interesting.
So there's that aspect of it. Then people are, not everyone's simple. Some people are in denial. Some people are very angry.
What kind of different reactions have you seen? I'm super curious.
I've seen, look, I think that there are certain patients that are very much like, I've lived a good life. I'm ready. Like, I'm good. And it's not always that they have accomplished some incredible thing. Sometimes they're just regular people. They're grandparents. They have loving families. They have loving kids. Sometimes they've been through a lot and they're done. They get to a point where they're like, I'm not doing this anymore. Like, it's over.
Meaning their actual breakdown of their body has been brutal?
Yes. Like, I think that they've been through, let's say, heart transplant and retransplant, or they've gotten a mechanical pump and that pump isn't working, or they've been waiting for transplant for lungs for a long time and the lungs aren't coming. And, I think that the stages of dying or grieving, kind of applies to all things, that sort of, anger, denial, acceptance, there's all those stages. And I think they're real. Like, you see depression and then recovery, you see people go through it. And I think the family reactions are interesting. I find that there's some families that are like, whatever they want, we just want her to be comfortable, Then there's these divided families where you can see that there's a lot of conflict in the family itself, and who feels like they should make the decision and who feels like they shouldn't. And
does that happen when the person is still conscious, or is that breakdown only when the person can't? Really?
I have seen the person who's dying be very disengaged from the conversation, and one family member pushing a lot. And it's not that they fight. If they fought back, it would be different. These are more people who are not speaking much, that are very, I don't want to use the word catatonic, but very withdrawn. Don't have, don't feel like engaging much in discussion because they're maybe depressed or exhausted. And they sort of have a relationship dynamic with their spouse or their partner or whoever, their child, where that person makes their decisions for them.
Who tends to go the craziest? Different. You must like thin slice the life out of people. They walk in, you're like, oh, that person's going to be a problem.
No, but it is funny. I feel like there are some people who in the beginning are very angry, and they're angry that their loved one has had a lot of complications, and sometimes complications happen. And those people are challenged, and they don't trust the healthcare system, or they've had an experience with someone else and they don't trust the healthcare system. They think we're trying to kill off their loved one. I find it's often more painful when people are younger, and it's not all bad. Sometimes it's very moving, and you see, families want to do the best for their loved one. We help them through a process. Like, we meet with them on Monday and we talk about what may or may not happen, and let's regroup in 4 days. And then in 4 days you regroup and you discuss, this isn't happening. It's not getting better. And people come to terms over time. But I think the reason it takes so long, besides that death is inherently hard to accept that your loved one is dying, is that we come from a culture where people think well, maybe if I transfer them to another hospital, they'll be able to save them. And it's like medicine doesn't keep you alive forever. There are some conditions that you just can't treat. And sometimes they're complicated and hard to explain. And that's hard for people to understand, especially when they don't have any science background.
Tell me more about the taking the body home, or taking the person home. They pass away at home, and then spending time with the body.
So I actually read this really interesting article about this, where I think that there's a story that this happened in this country with a man. I don't remember if he was in Seattle, where his wife died. She had had a long battle, and they kept her body in the home, in bed, for, family to come, for her children to be around, and sort of accept the time where you go through and realize that, like, they're not in that body anymore. Whatever your religious or spiritual beliefs are, a dead person is very different from that person alive. I don't know if you've seen a dead person with your own eyes, or seen someone you knew die and looked at them at a wake. But like, there is something very different about someone who's dead. And that experience of seeing, like, okay, well, they're not that, it's not like my loved one, Joe, or whoever, Mary, is there, but it's like they're gone.
I've been to several funerals where somebody that I cared about had passed away. Most of that was when I was growing up. So my grandparents, I was around for 3 of them dying. And then I recently had a former employee who I really cared about pass away, and went to his funeral. And all of that was heartbreaking. But were it not for another experience, which I will say in a second, I wouldn't understand what you're saying right now. But when my dog died, who was the first dog that my wife and I had, so we don't have kids, and I was traveling when he died. But like, I was on the flight home. Literally, I was texting back and forth with my wife. She was at the vet, and it was just all happening so fast. And so when I landed, I went straight to the vet, and I needed to see his body. It was so weird. And literally up until that moment, I thought, I always tell people, if you can predict something, it shouldn't be upsetting. So I was like, look, my parents are going to die. I get it. And I really felt detached from it. Like, I've loved them. I'm so connected to them now. I've run the thought experiment. So I'm not like putting it off. I'm never going to be like, oh my God, they're mortal. Like, that's so,
you faced it. Like,
100%. And so that way, when it happens, I will be absolutely crestfallen, but I won't be like, oh my God, I didn't see it coming. And why didn't I call more? Like, I won't be there. But when my dog died, I realized that's all bullshit. I will only have an emotional response. I will be overwhelmed. I'll be beating my chest and wailing. It's like it was this weird, deep-seated need to see his body, to know that he wasn't there anymore. It was so weird. It even now, I can understand it in that I went through it. So I know what it feels like from the inside, but it's like hard to recapture that sense when you're sort of emotionally sober and on the outside of it.
I mean, I think that one thing that I'm taking also from what you're saying is how differently we can feel about things at different times, and then think about how we felt at that time, but not necessarily be able to feel that same way again. Like, or you think about someone who's very depressed and they have this feeling like, saying things like, well, what does it matter? We're all going to die anyway. And like, that sort of very fatalistic feeling that they sort of can see the truth that we're all missing, right? I've had people describe it to me like that. Like, I can, you don't understand, but like, there's just no point in living because we're all going to die. Who cares if you win this award or you probably run that marathon? You're just dead in the end anyway. And then when you're not depressed, all of that goes away. And like, you don't see the world that way. You can't even relate to having that thought because you're preoccupied with training for the race and going to work and doing your job and seeing your kids, because it doesn't like enter your brain space. And it's the same I think about grief in some ways. It's like, it can be so overwhelming, and yet somehow you move past it so that you're not in that intense moment forever, right? And but we don't talk about death and dying at all. We don't talk about it to our kids. I mean, like, did your parents ever have a real discussion with you about dying? Like, what do you think happens when you die? Where do you go? Do you think there's anything?
No, and
Yeah.
that's really interesting. My parents, I never got like an official birds and bees talk. I never got
Right.
an official death and dying talk. Like when my grandparents died, um, I'm sure, like knowing my mom, I'm sure she was like, hey, if you need to express your emotion, express it. Like she would have been super, super
Right.
supportive. But there was never like this is what death means or this is how to process it or anything like that.
Right.
And you're
Do you
right.
think
Like
that you know what your parents want to have done if they were sick? Have they told you? Have you had that conversation?
my sister is the keeper of that information. So yes, but I think it is. My dad definitely does not want to be resuscitated.
Hmm.
I'm not sure about my mom.
I mean, I think the other thing that's hard for people is like, what does that mean? Like, of course, you would want to be resuscitated from something that you could survive, right? So, like, if you're need CPR because you have a heart attack, and if someone does CPR and you are recovered from that, you'll be okay. Then I want CPR. But if I'm like have end stage cancer and you try to resuscitate me for what? So that I can
Right.
die 2 days later, that's a different kind of CPR. So that's like another thing that needs to be talked about. But it's I don't know. I feel like in cultures in the East, death can take on a different meaning. This idea that like we don't spend any time with a dead body. I get it, kind of like it's dead, it's a creepy body, but also like, is that normal? Like maybe it's normal to be with the dead body and to process the death of your loved one. I don't know. I don't know what I would want. I don't know if I would want, but I probably wouldn't want a dead body in my house for that long because it would be upsetting, but that's because I've been raised to think that.
I'm super freaked out with anyone other than my wife. I'd be like, I would have my moment 100%. I would spend,
Yeah.
20, 30 minutes like,
Yeah.
it's rough and embodying that sense of loss was very cathartic with my dog. And I know that people will think that that's sort of weird, but for me, that was actually a very, very meaningful moment. So it was wildly cathartic. So I would definitely take that time. But with my wife, dude, is taxidermy out? Like I am
Right,
so attached to my wife that it's like to anything. Like what can I do to hold on to that? I worry that I would turn into that psychopath that like, her
right.
withered
Like
corpse is like in a chair in another room. And, I can't let it go. So, I probably need to do some thinking on that to not end up in a weird place. But,
yeah.
yeah.
Well, I think coronavirus has made everyone think about death a little bit because they've lost people. They've lost grandparents, they've lost parents, and then there was this incredible fear of death. That I think was so part of the quarantine was this fear of unnatural early death for everybody in a thing that we couldn't control and didn't understand. And I think that was scary. And I think that people are a little traumatized from that. And so I think this discussion of death is not so untimely just because I think it's something, I think that's been on people's minds.
Yeah, I think talking through it and figuring out what people want for themselves is also going to be really powerful. I know a lot of doctors have do not resuscitate. Where do you fall on the issue? What's your guidance?
I mean, I think I would want to be resuscitated like we just discussed. Like as long as I can go home and spend meaningful time with things that I do that I like. If I was in terrible pain that couldn't be changed, or I had no meaning in my life anymore because I couldn't actually engage with the people I love, then I would probably be fine with DNR. But like if I had a catastrophic event and was in the hospital on a breathing tube, out of it, I would want my family to stop care. I would not want them to keep me alive, in a vegetative state in some nursing home for what's the point of that? I mean, there's all kinds of extremes. I think most people fall in the middle somewhere, but they come to the middle in different ways, and there's always going to be the really extreme, like I refuse to let my person die, or, the opposite extreme where people kind of seem like they don't care, but you almost want them to be more involved in the care of their family member. That's less often, but I think for the most part, people are in the middle. I just think it's hard. I think that it's hard. And I think that coronavirus has made everybody really afraid. And so those things together, are hard. And then when you, on top of it, you make it so that we can't have their loved ones come in to talk about dying, and then 2 weeks after that happens, there's protests with thousands of people on the street. And Joe Schmo is saying, why couldn't I come in and say goodbye to my wife of 70 years? But these people are allowed to protest.
Oh my God.
We get
I
that.
would lose my mind.
Right. And I've had really angry families say this is this hypocrisy. Like, how can you tell us this when other people are allowed to be out? And we kind of had to stand the line and just say, I mean, I think actually we just are opening up our visitation policy like tomorrow or something. But we had for so long, we had to stand the line because we were trying to protect other people in the hospital, other people that didn't have COVID in the hospital, prevent transmission. I mean, you're walking into a place where the whole place has COVID. There was concerns that anybody who came in could get it very easily, especially if they're at the bedside.
Yeah, I would lose my mind. Like, speaking of,
By the way, I'm in no way saying that the protest shouldn't happen. I just want to clarify.
No, Jesus, I hope nobody would confuse that. Yeah, but it is blatantly a double standard. Whether it's a warranted double standard or not is a whole nother question. But you can imagine, like, just thinking about losing my wife, like when you've shared 70 years with somebody, and this is that moment where they go like, fuck, there is no more, like that is sort of that last. Yeah.
You want to hold their hand and they're saying no. And then you turn around and walk down the street and there's 10,000 people on the street. It feels painful.
Yeah. I can see people really losing their mind without in any way, shape or form diminishing the power of the protest. It's like, I would lose my mind. Yeah.
Right.
Jennifer, thank you so much for joining me, dude. This was so much fun. Like, where can people find you if they want to connect?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at Dr. Jen Haythe, JENNHAYTHE, and my Instagram is the same, Dr. Jen Haythe.
Amazing. Well, thank you again for joining me. This was wonderful. I really enjoyed that conversation. It's fantastic.
That was fun. Take care, okay?
You got it. All right, everybody.
Bye.
Subscribe, and until next time, my friends, be legendary. Take care. Hey everybody, it's time to talk about mental health. As a lot of you know, I suffered from anxiety for years, and trying to tackle something like that on your own is not always the best. So if any of you are feeling lost or hopeless or have anxiety or tremendous fear or feel like maybe you're sliding towards depression, getting help is a critical part of getting better. But a lot of people are nervous to even try out therapy or don't really know where to start. Well, now there is a service called BetterHelp that makes therapy more accessible and affordable. So you can get a counselor with the sort of expertise that might not be available to you locally. BetterHelp assesses your needs and matches you with a licensed professional therapist within 24 hours. You can log into your account anytime to message your counselor, and BetterHelp also has group and R sessions every week where members can learn in groups directly from licensed counselors on multiple topics like relationships and ways to overcome your anxiety. Especially if the thought of seeking help makes you even a little nervous, be sure to check out over 60,000 positive reviews posted on the BetterHelp site. That's help as in H-E-L-P. BetterHelp is committed to making it easy for you to access the therapeutic help you need, even if you've never gone to counseling before. It's free to switch therapists, it's more affordable than local therapy, and they even have financial aid available. BetterHelp wants you to start living a happier life today. Visit betterhelp.com/HT. Again, that's BetterHelp, help is spelled HELP/HT, and join over 500,000 people taking charge of their mental health with the help of an experienced professional. BetterHelp is professional counseling done securely online using your computer, tablet, or mobile phone through video calls, phone calls, or text messaging with licensed therapists who are certified by their state's board to provide therapy and counseling. It is not self-help, and it's not a crisis line. It's an online service available worldwide, and it has a massive network of counselors who have a broad and diverse range of specialties. BetterHelp costs just $65 per week, and financial aid is available for those who qualify during the sign-up process. As a viewer of Health Theory, you can get 10% off your first month. So visit betterhelp.com/HT and get the help you need today. All right, guys, take care and be legendary. Thank you guys so much for watching and being a part of this community. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe. You're going to get weekly videos on building a growth mindset, cultivating grit, and unlocking your full potential.